Welcome to Protected Trust Live. My name is Steve Goodman, training coordinator at Protected Trust, and joining me today is Jon Webster.
Hey, Steve.
How you doing?
Doing good.
I figured I'd leave a little pause for people to actually respond back to me.
Well, thanks for having me on today.
Anytime. In today's stream, we're going to be discussing teams. Now, I know this is something for our regular viewers that we've discussed before. However, we've only done it in a little bit of increments, like, here's how you create a team. And here's an external user. That was our latest one. Here's how you add an external user. But we haven't really gone over the core concept of Microsoft Teams. So thank you for coming on today. And I understand you're the one who's going to finally break it down for all of us. So
well, I'm certainly going to try.
All right.
Absolutely. So
I don't know if you have a presentation that you want to
do. I have some slides that I'd like to be able to kind of share as we're talking through our points.
Okay.
And also wanting to do some on-screen time with the Teams client. It's always easier to talk about something when you can actually show off what you're talking about.
Very true, very true. So do you want to get started with that right now, or do you want to talk about your favorite feature of Teams?
Favorite feature of Teams? Well, my favorite feature would really be the tabs that Teams introduces to the whole equation. What you see today is with Skype, you have an instant messaging client and you can have conversations. The conversations aren't persistent, and that's really all they are. They're conversations. What Teams does is they bring persistence to your conversations, and they also give you this ability to just introduce other popular or commonly used web pages or reports or spreadsheets. Microsoft Planner, all sorts of different channels can be added to a team. So your team never really has to leave the Teams client to do their everyday work.
Right, that's a very good point. Now that you say that, that actually may be my favorite feature, because we always talk about how, or we've always talked about how Teams is your one-stop shop. It combines several apps into one, but it doesn't really start that way. You kind of have to build it into what you want it to be.
Right. So just to kind of set the stage a little bit, Microsoft Teams is what Microsoft is preparing as a replacement for Skype for Business. Skype is your instant messaging client. It also works as your voice chat and screen sharing tool for inter-office communication, and with those PSTN licenses, you can talk to the outside world. Skype also lets you talk to other businesses. So if you have partners that you work with or clients that like to message you on Teams when in Skype when you're working on a project, or they need to get help on something, right now they would be doing that through Skype. So what Microsoft is working towards is integrating all those features that are in Skype into the Teams client, and then getting rid of Skype, just completely absorbing it into Teams. So by this time next year, hopefully, we won't be talking about Skype for Business, because it'll all be in Teams.
And is there a section about it replacing email?
So for inter-office communication, what the real vision is at Microsoft is to be able to eliminate this inter-office email exchanges. Because those exchanges typically go on for extended period of time. You want to add other people into your conversation. People want to drop off of the conversation.
Right.
And using email to do that can be very difficult. And then you're sharing files with people, and you want to collaborate on those files. And sharing links to files is great, but with Teams, you can just embed that file into the conversation and even work on the file in a collaborative sense inside the Teams client. You still have your traditional online, what do they call it, the online app for Word and Excel, and you've still got the desktop app, but you can also do it in Teams, and then your conversation about that file sits right next to the document that you're editing inside the Teams client.
Right. I was thinking about making a video about Teams, in which it starts off with me throwing all my quick starts and shortcuts into the recycling bin, because you can just all access it from the Teams app.
Yeah. The other thing that Microsoft is really kind of positioning Teams to help with is the elimination of using SharePoint standalone. SharePoint's not going away. Teams is built on SharePoint. but you shouldn't have to go into SharePoint to access those SharePoint files. They've built the Teams client to let you get to that stuff in a very concise, organized way instead of having to step out of where you're currently working and go to a web page or launch an application to get to it. It's all right there inside Teams.
It's very good. A lot of people have shell shock when it comes to SharePoint. Whenever we onboard a new client, they're like, we know we have to be using this thing, but we don't know how to use it, and we're stuck in our old ways. But what you're saying is, with Teams, it's kind of in the background. It powers it all, but people don't really know they're using SharePoint.
Right. And then if you're trying to get to files on the go, instead of having to have a SharePoint app installed to manage your files, you can just go to that Teams app that you're already chatting with your coworkers and sharing files with one another right there and get to your files that are in SharePoint through Teams.
And if you are one of those people who like SharePoints, there is a button in order to access the actual web client for SharePoint.
Exactly.
So it's a good mixture right now.
Yeah, and there are situations where being able to go to the SharePoint site is just the right approach to working on something. But I found it a lot easier to find my files by going into Teams and then clicking the Open in SharePoint button than having to log into SharePoint and navigate through the many different SharePoint sites that I have access to.
Right, because if you're following a lot of them, or even if you're not following them, it shows like ones that you might be interested in.
Right.
It's like I don't want to see any of that. I just want to go right to the thing I'm looking for.
And that's kind of the other thing with SharePoint today. People tend to build it to look a lot like a file server. Mm-hmm. So you have all these top-level sites for each department, and then you have a bunch of sub-sites, and you have to manage permissions to all those sub-sites and making sure that, well, the guy in finance also needs to have access to some report in the billing system that's managed by the support team or the sales team. And so you now have all these complex permissions that you're having to juggle. And what Teams will do is kind of flatten that. And if you need to give your sales guy access to that document or those files, you can just add him to the sales team, and now he automatically has access to that site. And if you want to have more security around different groups of files, then just create another team for those files that have a specific security requirement. And now you don't have to worry about managing complex layers of permissions on individual files. But because it is in SharePoint, you still have the option of giving somebody access to a single file inside your SharePoint site without adding them to the team.
And revoking access too.
Right.
And it's very fluid, so you can like spin up a team. Like you used to be, you had to go to your admin before to create a SharePoint site and say, these are the members that I want added to it. I'm talking about maybe a few years ago, not right now. But end users are able to spin this up on their own, right?
They are. The same is true of SharePoint sites. So another concept with Teams is you can create a team from an existing Microsoft Office 365 group, is what they call it. And a 365 group is an extension of a standard distribution group. So Microsoft started with a distribution group, then they moved to a Office 365 distribution group, which added a team site in addition to the SharePoint site. The distribution group. And then with Teams, they added chatting and the tabs into that conversation. So it's kind of adding more and more features as you go from one technology to the other. And you can convert from a distribution group to a 365 group, and then from a 365 group to a team site, to a Teams team, I should say.
And is that something you'll show us today?
We might go into that.
We might venture into that territory?
Yeah, just a little bit.
Okay.
The other thing that always comes up when we're talking about Teams is there's so many options out there between the distribution groups, the 365 groups, I should say. You've got Yammer now, you've got Skype, and you've got Teams. And as we were talking about earlier, Yammer is, as we were talking about earlier, Skype is being integrated into Teams. So while all the features aren't there yet, you will kind of want to use Skype and Teams at the same time right now. In the near future, that won't be an issue. But for your distribution groups, it's going to generally make more sense to just use a team for all of your needs. You might end up with resources that you don't need, but it's not hurting anything to have them there. And with Yammer, specifically, Yammer is really more of a tool that Microsoft has built for engaging your broader community. You can create like a YouTube channel. Anybody in the world can join your YouTube channel and follow it and see the documents that you're posting. So those would be things that you might put in a Yammer group where you could talk about announcements that your company is making to the rest of your community. And they can join in and have conversations with you inside that Yammer group. With Teams, it's more for the inter-office communication. It's its primary capability. And it does allow you to invite external users to work on projects and things like that. So it's really lets you do anything you want, but primarily Yammer is going to be open to the public, let people join as they want to and see what you're all about, and then they leave as they're ready to move on to do other things.
Right, yeah, and I think once we start using Yammer more internally, I will at least have a better concept of it. But that's how Teams started with us. You know, we didn't really use it, and we had a lot of people who didn't want to give up Skype because, you know, we used Link, and then we used Skype, and then Skype for Business, or I'm not sure what the order is. But it was very hard to pull people away from using Skype. But I mean, within a week of everyone starting to use Teams, they were totally convinced to use it. And
the same is true with the Yammer and Teams. It's like, do we have this conversation in Teams? Do we have it in Yammer? Well, if you're not talking to your larger audience that your company is reaching out to in your user community, then typically the right answer is going to be to use Teams.
Okay.
So let's see here. We talked about which one. Then we've got the difference between team sites and SharePoint sites. And the main difference between team sites and SharePoint sites is you get those tabs and you have a persistent conversation. We had talked about the conversation a little bit earlier, but to go into that further, when somebody joins a public team, teams can be public or private. When somebody joins a team, they can have access to all the conversations that have taken place in that team from the beginning of time. So in some situations, I'll be working with a team and I'll finish whatever project I was assisting them with, and then I'll just leave the team. And then if I need to be added back to the team, then I'm right back in there and I can see the conversations that have led up to where we are today. So
right, so and that's something you don't get with Skype. Well, I mean, let me pause for a second. So if you don't turn on the feature for conversation history with Skype, then once you close that window, the conversation's gone.
Right.
Right. Or if you do turn it on,
you can never be added to a conversation and see that conversation leading up to you being invited to it with Skype.
And with Teams, the conversation is always there whether you leave or not.
Yep. And it doesn't exist at all in SharePoint. So there are team sites in SharePoint, but you really want to be using a Teams team, not a SharePoint team. That's always a little confusing. It's like, do you have a team site? I mean a Teams team site, not a Microsoft SharePoint team site, but a Teams team site. So the next thing I've got up here is something that's really interesting, is channels in Microsoft Teams. So I'm going to just kind of pull up a team here and talk about channels for a little bit. So in my screen, can you see my screen over there?
I can see your screen.
Excellent. So on my screen, I've got a team here called All Company. And depending on the size of your company, it may make sense to have an all-company team. If you're over 3,000 employees, then all-company might be too many people in one team, and you'd want to break that into departments such as business development. But if you're small, less than 3,000 people, less than 1,000 people, having an all-company team is a great place for everybody to be able to come and talk about whatever they want to talk about. They could be talking about stuff in the general channel. You could be posting announcements in a channel that is specific to announcements. You could have a video dedicated to, a channel dedicated to cat videos on the internet that everybody else in your company might find interesting. And then another example of a channel is RSS feeds. If there are RSS feeds that are interesting to you as a company, instead of having individual people sign up to those RSS feeds and consume them through whatever RSS reader they prefer, you can actually build a channel and create a, what do they call it, a connector. Whoops, come on mouse. You can build a connector that will pull in an RSS feed or multiple RSS feeds from around the internet. And for us internal, we have an RSS feed for all the new features that Microsoft is releasing. Did you know that Microsoft and Azure is releasing 2 new features every day?
I was not aware of that.
It's true. 2 new features every day. So every 90 days, there has been 180 new things that have been made available in Azure, or it could be existing products that had new features added to them. So there's a lot to consume in that space. So what we do in our RSS feeds channel is when somebody sees something interesting, they can mention the channel or mention the whole team and say, hey, check out this new feature that we just saw in the RSS feed, to kind of draw attention to that feature.
Right.
So I'm just going to close out of here. So another interesting thing about channels, if you have used any other kind of team chat solutions such as Slack, I guess, these concepts may be somewhat familiar to you. With a team, you have a couple of things that you can mention. The symbol is what you use to mention something. So you can mention a person. If that person is a member of the team, you can mention them specifically, and then they get a little notification that they've been mentioned somewhere, and it'll show up in their activity feed as, hey, you were mentioned over here. You can mention a channel. Let's see if it'll do it.
Do you have a channel named channel?
No. If you type you type in the keyword channel, then it will mention the channel that you're currently in.
Oh, I didn't know that.
So instead of having to know the name of your channel, you can just
it'll pull up the list
channel and it'll pull up your channel.
Oh, that's awesome.
You can mention the channel, and you can mention the team. So if you type in @team, it'll mention the team that you're currently in. Now, the difference between those 3 things, if you mention a person, they get an individual notification. If you mention the team, every member of that team receives a notification. But if you mention the channel, only people who have that channel listed as a favorite, you're following the channel. Let's see, so you've got this little star there. Only people who are following that channel will receive the notification. So you might have a cat videos channel, and you don't want to tell the whole company that you posted a new video in the cat videos. But if the person's following that channel, then you can mention the channel, and everybody that's wanting to know that updates are available will get that notification because they were following it.
Right. They signed up for it.
Right. And if they don't want to get those notifications anymore, they can just unfollow the channel. And what happens when you unfollow it, now it's not going to do quite the same thing here because there aren't that many channels. But if you have a lot of channels, then you'll end up with a little more, kind of like down here at the bottom where it says more. You'll end up with one of those in your channels list as well, where you can go in and see all the channels that you're not following.
Right.
And that's the same deal with teams. You can be a member of a team and not have it a favorite, and then it just shows up under more. But if somebody mentions that channel, you still get notified that that channel received a mention.
Very cool.
And what we like to do is make our channels public so that if somebody doesn't even want it to show up in their more list, they can leave the channel and join whenever they want to. And it's just kind of a free-flowing place to have a dialogue.
Right. And that's a good point. Well, not really point, but a thing you showed, which was public. So when you create a team, you can make it public or private.
Right.
So when it's private, is it searchable when you make it private? Like, does it show up as a team?
I don't think so.
So
they're constantly making improvements to teams and adding new features. The last thing I recall on that topic is by default, teams were originally public. And most recently, they changed the default setting to be a private team. And when you're looking for teams, I'm pretty sure it only shows you the public teams. And that can actually cause an issue if you have your marketing department create a private channel, and then somebody else in the company wants a marketing channel that they can be a member of. They may not know that your team already exists. And so you can end up with duplicate teams if you're not too careful.
So it's good practice to start as a public team.
Yeah, unless you have some security concerns around the data that you're going to be discussing, like the finance team, for example, may not want their credit cards or whatever that they store in SharePoint. Not that you should store credit cards in a SharePoint site, but if that sort of information was in there, you wouldn't want that public.
Well, let me go off the trail a little bit. But would DLP cause that to not happen? Have credit card information in a SharePoint site?
DLP, that's a good question. I'm not sure if they've got DLP working with Teams yet. I know that they did recently add support for data governance.
Mm-hmm.
So with Skype, for example, there are a couple of solutions, especially in Microsoft's their new e-discovery portal. You can have retention on a Skype conversation. They recently added that ability to Teams. You can now have data governance on your team sites. Whoops.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not sure about the DLP. It wouldn't surprise me if it was coming. Let's see here. Another thing that I did want to bring up is that we talked about being able to create teams from an existing Office 365 group. One of the things that is currently not supported, and as you can tell here, it's a very popular request, is being able to convert an existing SharePoint site into a team.
Mm-hmm.
So that feature is not there yet, but if you wanting to have a new feature in Teams, or if you're interested in what features other people are interested in, the microsoftteams.uservoice.com website is the place to go. You can find out all sorts of features, and some of them are bug reports, and a lot of them are just new features that would be nice to have. So DLP might be something that's in here. Come on, up. So what I was going to do real quick is just type in DLP and see what we get. I don't see any feature requests for data loss prevention, at least not by the acronym. No, it doesn't look like they got anything about that. So if it's not a feature that exists today, we might want to add a feature request if they include DLP for Teams.
We will have to do that.
I wonder if, since it is based on SharePoint, it might be tied to that. And if there's a DLP in SharePoint, then Teams just kind of inherits that.
Because it's using SharePoint as its base.
Exactly, yeah.
Without you even realizing it.
SharePoint's a pretty powerful thing, especially if you have a file server in your office right now.
Mm-hmm.
It's a completely different experience to move that file server into SharePoint, because now you don't have to worry about sharing files with other people. If you've got multiple people collaborating on the same file, you probably run into issues with this file is currently locked and in use by another user.
Mm-hmm.
That issue's gone once you move to SharePoint.
Yeah, I remember that was a big concern. Someone actually challenged me saying, no, that never used to be the case. And I was like, oh yeah. Oh, I remember it clearly. That was definitely the case.
Oh yeah.
But of course you could put that feature back on with, oh gosh, what's it called? Checkout, right?
You can check out files, but checking out a file is really something that's reserved for non-Office documents. If you are using an Office document, Excel, Word, SharePoint, PowerPoint,
right.
Visio,
Mm-hmm.
there's really no reason to check out that file, because other people can edit the file at the same time you are.
And if they do something you don't like, you can always revert back with versioning.
Yeah. I guess the only real use case today for checking out files that I'm aware of would be if you were going to be working offline on that file and you wanted to submit your updates after you got back into the office.
Mm-hmm.
But I was on a plane and traveling for a couple of weeks last month, and I still had access to the internet, and I was even making updates to files in SharePoint from my mobile device, which was quite an interesting experience. Made me appreciate the large screen I had on that new phone. So that's all I got there. Right, this page right here is the Teams web interface. So there's a, what do they call that? A web app for Teams that you can find right in your portal.
And a mobile app too.
Yep. The only reason I have Skype on my mobile phone right now is because Teams doesn't quite handle external phone calls as well as Skype does.
Mm-hmm. But they're looking to have that integration completed or close to being complete by the end of the year, I believe.
Yeah, third and fourth quarter of this year. I actually was talking to somebody in the Teams team,
Mm-hmm.
the people developing Teams at Microsoft last week, and they were telling me that communicating with external organizations, which is different from inviting an external user as a guest into your team,
Mm-hmm.
just being able to talk to somebody like you do with Skype that's in another organization, and the ability to do the phone calls is coming real soon.
Oh, wow. That's really interesting.
Yep. Exciting stuff. Let's see here. Go back to my PowerPoint. So, the Channels tab. That's right. So what I'm going to do right now is talk a little bit about channels, tabs in channels. You got a team, you got a channel inside the team, and then you have a tab, which is what you saw right here across the top. You got your instant messages, conversations, and conversations. You got your SharePoint files under files, and let's see here. Where did that button to open in SharePoint go? There we go. Come on.
You gotta have files in there.
I think you're right. There are a couple of things. Yeah, look at that. There's our open in SharePoint button right there. You got a Wikipedia if you want to have like a little internal knowledge base of documents. All these come default with a new team, and you can delete them if you don't want to, or start using them.
What's the difference between that and OneNote?
OneNote you can open inside OneNote.
Oh, okay.
So there is that.
Uh-huh.
OneNote lets you have categories and workbooks and a couple of other layers of documents,
Mm-hmm.
where a wiki is really just a series of documents that have an index. So another cool thing with OneNote, I'm not sure that a wiki does it yet, is you can create different types of elements, such as a checklist in OneNote, and then you can start checking off the things that you've done. Or you could just create a plan in your team, and plan is the Microsoft Planner, and that gives you the buckets where you have things to do. You can set a date on when that event is happening, and you can assign it to a person.
Can you assign yourself?
You should be able to. There we go.
Oh, okay.
So you can talk about those things, and you can create a done bucket over here, or a in progress. Oh, come on.
It's just an easy project management tool.
Yeah, if you're familiar with the Scrum design, you have a couple of buckets when you're working on something that is either your backlog, your in progress, and your completed, and you can drag and drop things between those different buckets. I'm having a little trouble. I'm using a Surface here with a touchpad, and me and touchpads just don't seem to get along.
Well, I should also mention that when you create a planner, I guess a planner site, is that what it's called?
Yeah, plan.
A plan?
Yeah.
Well, when you create a new plan, it will also create a team.
Is that right?
Mm-hmm. They work
Interesting.
vice versa.
Yeah, I think the last time I have a personal planner for myself. I think I ended up with a personal team, private team, just so I'd have a planner that I
Just
could
chatting
get
to
to
yourself.
inside teams
Yeah.
that nobody else could really see unless I wanted them to.
I mean, it makes sense because when you create a plan, you want to talk about it, obviously, and what better place to do that
Yeah.
but in Teams.
So I wanted to just show you real quick, when you add a new tab, here's a list of all the things that you can add in that tab. And Microsoft is adding new things to this list on a pretty frequent basis. And they've also released plenty of documentation on how to build your own integrations. So the sky's the limit.
So you don't have to add just Microsoft products. You can add third-party products to your team.
Yep, they've got Hootsuite, which is a
Social media.
social media management type deal. You got Zendesk, which is a support system. SurveyMonkey, which is kind of tied to marketing and external outreach. You got some monitoring systems in here. You got your GitHub, so your developers can start getting hooks into teams that notify everybody on the team when things are happening. So they got lots of stuff in here. My favorite tab is probably going to be the Power BI reports.
Yikes. That's a big yikes for a lot of people.
Power BI, for those of you that don't know, is basically Excel on steroids. Mm-hmm. You can create reports in Excel that are based on the data that's inside your Excel document. Power BI gives you that kind of capability for any number of data sources. You got your traditional SQL and your ODBC connectors, but you can also integrate it with Excel and even live streaming data from whatever system that you want to stream data from. Internally, we use it to stream live statistics on how many support tickets we have open, for example. Mm-hmm. So we can just walk by and see a Power BI report inside Teams of how many tickets are open in individual tiers of support or by different companies. It's really powerful, and if you've had trouble creating reports in Excel before, Power BI actually makes it easier to create reports.
Really?
So it's a lot of fun to start digging into that data. You can get lost in just kind of reanalyzing that business intelligence.
So would a good way to make it more understandable, is it like Excel if it were in real time?
Yeah.
It's
it can be in real time. Most of the data isn't real time, but it's a lot easier than having to go into an Excel document and update an Excel document.
It just pulls from the source,
right.
And then you set
it
when
generates
you
the report in real time on external data sources.
Gotcha.
So we love our Power BI reports, and you just can have a separate tab in the channel for each Power BI report that's specific to that department. Mm-hmm. So the sales team might have a sales report, finance team could have finance reports, support teams would have statistics on their support system and their ticket counts. Lots of fun stuff.
And the graphs are pretty.
And the graphs are phenomenal.
But that's another live stream. Can't get into how to make pretty graphs in this one.
Another thing that is worth mentioning is that in a team, mm-hmm. every team channel has an email address. So if you're used to emailing a distribution group to some information or forwarding emails to a team to review, you can forward those emails to the email address that's created for each channel. And that's the easiest way to kind of transition information from a traditional email to a team conversation, is to just forward that email that you want to talk about into Teams.
Or if you don't want to do that, when you create a team, it also creates a group, and that group also has a email address for a distribution list.
It does, but the email that you send to that group doesn't show up in the conversation.
Not in the Teams conversation.
Right.
So if you really want to stick with email, then you would just rely on the group's DL
right.
or distribution list instead of using the Teams email address. So that, I don't know, why would you live in two environments when you can just live in one?
Yeah, I'm finding fewer and fewer reasons to look at my Outlook client every day.
Right.
There's still the customers that you have to communicate with, those folks that are in office that don't have Teams, that you still got to use your traditional email with. But
now that external feature or the external users are being added to Teams, or has been added, but you have to add the external users yourself.
Yeah.
I don't know. Do you think the future of email is bleak?
It's not going to be going away anytime soon,
right.
But it's certainly going to represent a lot less of the conversations that take place.
Mm-hmm. And it makes it more secure because, in the past couple of live streams we've been talking about phishing, and where does phishing come from? From email.
That's right. It's pretty tricky to create a phishing conversation inside Teams because you have to authenticate into Teams to have that conversation. You can't just send an anonymous message like you do with email.
Right.
But I lost my train of thought.
Uh-oh.
Moving on.
Time to look at the PowerPoint again.
Let's see, what's next? Making the transition to Teams.
Oh, this should be fun.
Oh, yeah. So today, our company, we started with a traditional file server.
Right.
Removed it to SharePoint. and then we redesigned our SharePoint site because we didn't like the names of our departments, or we did some reorganization of our departments. And so then we had to move all the content from one team site to another team site in SharePoint, not a Teams team, a SharePoint team. Mm-hmm. And now you have it in Teams, and it's that transition of moving all those files from the SharePoint team into the Teams team. But the transition to Teams is really first identifying who those large groups of people are that use files in your organization. And if you've got a file server or a bunch of team sites, then you probably already have those teams figured out. You've got your sales and your marketing or your projects or whatever those high-level SharePoint sites are. Just create teams for those things and move all your files that are in the team site into the Teams team site.
So it can be as easy as dragging it from your in-house file server and just dragging all the content into.
If you don't already have your data in SharePoint, the first step that you probably want to do is to migrate everything to SharePoint and preserve your folder structure just the way it is. And the reason I say that is because if you're using a file server, you probably don't have very good backups, and the ability to restore files to a point in time is probably a little tricky. And once you get it in SharePoint, you have the SharePoint engine to help you make all that stuff possible. And you really want to get those features out to your users as quickly as you can. The file locking issues and things like that go away once you're in SharePoint. And then once you're in SharePoint, you can start making that transition to the Teams SharePoint sites. Now, one of the things I wanted to mention on the transition topic is you can create a tab that connects a document library from another team or SharePoint site into your new team. So you put everything in SharePoint into their normal sites, you create your teams, and then you add a tab that links users back to where their files are stored in SharePoint. And then eventually you want to move all that data into the Teams files so that you can break them into the individual channels and just get rid of the manually created SharePoint sites and rely on the Teams created SharePoint sites. Another really cool feature when we're talking about migrating to Teams is, we mentioned if you're on a file server, you go to SharePoint first. Once you're in SharePoint, you now have access to OneDrive to sync those files to your local machine. And in the past, and I say in the past, in the computer world is, if it was 6 months ago, it's the distant past.
Right.
So within the last 6 to 12 months, Microsoft has made significant improvements to the SharePoint sync client so that you no longer have to sync an entire SharePoint site to your hard drive to have access to it locally. And instead of the whole site, you can choose how much data you want to sync. And that gives you easy access. If somebody's familiar with having a groups drive or something that is mapped, it's not going to be the same drive letter, but they can still get to it from the File Explorer navigation window.
Unless you name that SharePoint site a drive letter.
That might make things a little more complicated, but if it works for you,
it can be done.
I'm happy for you.
It can be done. Steve Cornell and I, service desk manager Steve Cornell, we went over the process of how to get your OneDrive set up for files on demand.
And once you do that, you can still use that for your files in Teams because Teams runs on SharePoint.
Right. It's all connected.
That's right. But you don't need to because your files are also inside Teams. So it makes for a very gradual transition. You can move files slowly. Just go to this channel. If it's not there, check the old channel. We may not have finished moving it.
Yeah, so we sometimes recommend for people who are interested in migrating is to take a department and move them all over first and see how it goes with them. That's really the best way.
Yeah, it's always good to start with your IT department. That way, if any questions come up, they've had some experience. They've been behind the wheel for a little while. And it looks like that's the last topic that I had on my list of talking points.
Well, we did it. we made it through.
All right. So is there any other questions that you think people might want to talk about?
Well, One thing I do want to say, we've been doing a lot of the presentation using the web interface, and Teams actually doesn't come with the standard download of Office 365. If
That's right.
you know, when you first sign in, if it's your first time signing into Office 365, your company just moved and you logged in with your username and password and you click download Office 365, Teams doesn't come with it.
That's true.
Or at least the download doesn't. So it's available in the online app, and if you go to it, yeah, we could just show it. That is where you will find the button to download Teams.
So if we go to our portal.office.com and then click on Teams over here. Got a nice little download button up here.
Yep. And there's also, I don't remember the URL off the top of my head. If you don't want to go through sign in here.
Teams.microsoft.com.
There you go.
Should
Simple enough.
take you to the same place. And that's also available in the iOS and Android Play Store.
Right. And notifications too. Maybe we should talk about, before we end, let's talk about notifications.
Okay.
So I used to get really angry that I wasn't getting emailed for when a team, because remember, we had to adjust just like everyone else.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know, I don't know the best way to explain it. Outlook used to be my go-to to check for all my internal stuff, so I never had Teams open in a window. So I didn't know when I was being notified. But if you keep it open, there's different ways to get notified on when you receive a message. One of those notification methods we did was when you mention someone, that will send you an email. But for other ways, there's a notification setting that it's set up for you to customize yourself. I don't remember what the defaults are. Are they all the?
There's some defaults here. Personal dimensions will do a banner and send an email. It's worth mentioning that if somebody mentions you and you have Teams open, you're going to get the banner inside Teams, but, well, I'm not sure about these defaults. I have to check my own settings, but I don't get emails for things for notifications unless I don't have Teams open.
Mm-hmm.
If I don't have Teams open on my mobile phone or in Outlook, then I'll get an email saying that somebody's mentioned me somewhere. If I have those things open, then you get the little shield that tells you that somebody's mentioned you, and you may not get the notification unless you go in here and change those settings to send an email.
Yeah, also if you haven't checked Teams in a while, then it will send you emails as well.
Right.
But if you're actively using Teams, then yeah, it'll just use the notification bar.
Yeah, and you'll notice here that you get a notification when somebody replies to a conversation you started, mm-hmm. or that you replied to. So you don't have to mention somebody every time you respond to their conversation, because their notification settings should be set so that they get notified when somebody responds to them.
Or you can mute all of it and not receive a single notification. But
yeah,
I think the best way to adopt Teams is to open it up like you do Outlook. Like you don't just check an email and then close Outlook. You keep Outlook open throughout the day, and that's the same way you should use Teams, is just keep Teams open throughout the day, and then that way when you see something turn into a bold font,
right,
you know
just
that
like
there's
you
an
see
update.
In business development over here.
Right, then you know that there's an update.
We can expand that, and we see that there is an update in the pipeline. And the activity is usually a pretty good place to find where you've been mentioned recently. Another item worth mentioning is that at the very top of the Teams client you have that search bar, and you can just like you would in Outlook, search for whatever you fancy. Anything that's in SharePoint in the Teams side or conversations will be searched when you use that search bar up there.
Yeah, because the what's that called? Forum setup? How you can like go back in time and in your chat. What kind of setup is that called? When
history?
You scroll up. Yeah, the history, the chat history. It can be a pain to scroll.
Yeah.
If you're talking about a couple months worth of chat history, so just use the search button and pull up the common or the keyword that you're looking for.
Yep, very true. One thing that I was looking at some of the other notes that I made here. Let me see if I can pull this up. One thing that I had a conversation with somebody about recently is that, as you mentioned, out of the box, anybody can create a group, anybody can create a team site, anybody can create a Teams team. But a lot of times you'll find that, especially when first being introduced to the product, people will create teams for everything under the sun because they may not have the same experience with using channels in an existing team. Mm-hmm. So you may end up with a lot of channels or a lot of teams that really would better work out as channels in an existing team, and you may end up with a lot of teams that end up being abandoned. Mm-hmm. And so Microsoft does provide you with some useful tools for kind of identifying teams that aren't active and teams that don't have any members and things of that nature. They give you access to it through the PowerShell interface. Mm-hmm. But an important thing for people to understand when they start using Teams is just kind of a simple decision-making process when thinking about, should I create a team? Should I create a channel? Should I do something else entirely? And really the first question that I ask myself when wanting to start a new conversation is, am I concerned that this conversation will be lost in the channel that I am thinking of putting it in? Because if that's the case, I may want to create a new channel for that conversation so it always stays present. Another thing to think about is, do I want to control who gets notified when I'm making updates? Because you want to be able to use that mention of a channel mm-hmm. to bring the people in that conversation back to the conversation. And if you have that conversation in your general channel that everybody's following, then your audience is a little too big and they may get annoyed at you.
Yeah. But with a channel, though, anyone who has permission to that team, they're going to see whatever channel you create. So you can't block off a channel and say, oh, I only want specific members of this team to see
right.
it. If you create a channel in a team, all the members are going to see that channel.
It's not that they'll see it, but they will have access to it.
Right.
So you create a public team, then you create channels inside that team. That means anybody can join those conversations at any time. So if you do have security concerns about the information that you're discussing, then you want to use a team that limits the membership. But ideally, you'd be able to do it within a department. Mm-hmm. And there are plenty of situations where you need to create a team for a couple of weeks or for a couple of months, and then you're ready to kind of destroy the team because you don't need it anymore, archive it. But if you just create that as a channel because you're not concerned about the security, the access that people might have to that information, it's really easy to just archive the channel and remove it from your favorites, and it's still there if you ever want to resurrect it or revisit it. So from a management standpoint, the less teams you have, the less cluttered your team's experience will be.
Right. Just keep the ones that are being used and delete the ones that aren't being used.
Yeah, it can be tough to delete stuff. There's always going to be content that you may have put in there. That's kind of another point too. If you're planning to create a team, mm-hmm. and the only channel that you ever envision having in that team is general, and you don't plan on putting any files in that team, then it may not be suited to be its own team.
I see. It needs to be teams worthy.
There's always exceptions to rules. There's, whatever makes you comfortable. Try it, see if you like it. But our experience has been, and the recommendation we get from Microsoft is that your team's experience will be enhanced if you're not sitting there scratching your head, where was that conversation I had? Because I'm a member of 30 different teams, and they all have one channel in them.
Right. Good point. I think that's a good place to stop.
All right.
Thank you so much for joining us on our Teams chat. Any final thoughts?
Go forth and create teams.
Right. The best way to use Teams is to just start using Teams. That's the best
right.
way to adopt it. So thank you, John, and thank you to our clients who make these videos possible. And if you like our content, please click the like button or the subscribe button if you want to be notified each time we do a new live stream. And so thanks, everyone. We'll see you next time on Tuesday next week at 2:30. Bye.
Bye.